Welcome to the Matt Waller Podcast, where we look at success at the intersection of technology, logistics, supply chain, retail, and CPG, also known as the retail value chain. I want to clarify that this podcast is distinct from my responsibilities as a professor in the Sam M. Walton College of Business. Nonetheless, it aligns with my aspiration to provide practical insights to professionals and business by showcasing companies and people that can enhance your ability to manage, lead, and strategize and market effectively in the retail value chain. Before we dive into today's exciting episode, I'd like to thank our sponsor, New Road Capital Partners. New Road invests in proven technologies, services, and products that serve unmet needs in the marketplace. They look for companies in supply chain and logistics, as well as consumer-oriented companies. For more information, go to newroadcp.com. I would also like to disclose that I am a strategic advisor to New Road. I'd also like to recognize podcastvideos.com for the services they provide for these podcasts. I'm very pleased with their services. And now, without further ado, let's get into the exciting episode. I am so excited about this podcast today. If you're involved in business, you have been involved in procurement in one way or another at some point in your career. But procuring truckload transportation has a lot of idiosyncrasies that you don't see in other areas. And yet, it's a huge business. It's $700 billion per year in our economy. So if you're running a business, you need to understand procurement transportation. And so today, I'm talking with one of the top experts in the world on this, who's been involved in it for decades. His name is George Abernathy, and I'm really excited to have him on the show today. George is a seasoned executive with over 3 decades of experience in this industry. And he's had many leadership roles over the past 3 decades. But since July of 2020, George has been serving on the board of, and since 2021, as the president of Emerge, a logistics and supply chain company based in Scottsdale, Arizona. Under his commercial leadership, Emerge's platform has procured over $15 billion of freight for hundreds of shippers and tens of thousands of carriers. So you're going to learn a lot from this podcast. In addition to his role at Emerge, George also serves on the board of directors and as a strategic advisor for Highway, a role he took in May of 2022. His strategic acumen and industry knowledge have proven invaluable for the company. George is also involved in academia. You'll hear early on in our talk today that he'll talk about a dissertation that was written at MIT back in the 90s. He's involved in academia and practice, but he's on the advisory council of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences of Assumption University in Massachusetts. Prior to his current roles, George was the president of FreightWaves, a media and analytics company for the freight markets in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and from November 2017 to November 2021, he played a pivotal role in driving the company's growth and success. Before that, he spent over a decade at Transplace, which is now called Uber Freight, and he rose to the position of president of that company. He's had so much experience in this area. In fact, he began his career in logistics and transportation with J.B. Hunt, where he was vice president of marketing from 1985 to 1990. But he has just a tremendous experience, and you'll see that in this podcast interview, it really is a conversation. And I tried to also have George flesh out some of the details and some of the concepts that many people don't understand that aren't directly in the industry. So I think you're really going to enjoy it. George, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm thrilled to have you.
It's a pleasure to do this with you, Dr. Matt. Really, really looking forward to it.
Well, as I said when I introduced you, you are one of the most knowledgeable people I know when it comes to procurement of transportation. So I want to start with a little bit of history here.
Mhm.
And I'd like to get your view on, deregulation of the trucking industry was such a milestone in the economic history of the United States. Really remarkable. But, when you consider the fact that over-the-road transportation is about 70% of total U.S. freight movements by revenue, what would you say, how has deregulation really influenced the trucking industry and the U.S. economy?
Well, it is a great question and really a terrific jumping off point, Matt, because the impact in 1980, it is so long ago, but so many of the challenges and opportunities that came from that are still being addressed. You can look to the impact that it's had on what carriers were around back then. The statistic continues to change that only a handful, if not less than a handful, of the carriers that were the top 50 back in 1980 even exist today. We just lost Yellow a few weeks ago. So any relationships or the like, if I had a facility near a particular motor carrier and got access to it because of that motor carrier, if it was around in 1980, has a greater than average likelihood that it's not around anymore. The other things, and I appreciate the compliments with regards to being a real transportation procurement nerd. I've been chasing optimality, Matt, around transportation procurement for multiple decades. And, even back to high school and college when I was loading cereal cases onto trucks, that was around that time frame. And I could really see how this was changing because we were changing the motor carriers that were being utilized, and to the benefit of that end user. One of the people that I was lucky enough, Matt, to work with was Chris Kaplis back at Sabre and then at logistics.com. Chris of MIT and also chief scientist over at DAT. Chris wrote his doctoral dissertation, Matt, in 1996 at MIT. I think he was recognized by CSCMP in 1997.
He was, yeah.
But when you look at what Chris wrote about, he wrote about the challenges and opportunities that transportation procurement had in 96. And so many of those things that he saw starting to evolve only 16 years after the deregulation happened, the movement, the tonnage that was being moved was increasing greatly, but the average cost per ton was going down. We're still experiencing that kind of opportunity. You expanded the number of small carriers that could exist with deregulation. We weren't looking at hundreds of thousands of motor carriers back then. So the challenges of losing so many of those main carriers, the top 50, so many of the things that were regulated that you could go get and have a regulation on have changed. What I'm amazed at, looking back at Chris's dissertation, the things he was writing about then have evolved, and I see over the last 4 or 5 years a remarkable increase in pace in taking advantage of some of those opportunities, because technology has really moved to a point that some of the things you hoped could happen back then now can happen because of some of the technology advances that we've seen.
Well, I remember that. I remember when his dissertation was recognized. I also remember an article he had in Journal of Business Logistics. Just this year, he co-authored an article in Journal of Business Logistics that's a literature review. In fact, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. It's a literature review of all the research that's really happened in this area as a result. And it's a great article. But so George, you mentioned, the number of carriers proliferated dramatically. And now we're talking about an industry, the truckload industry is around $700 billion a year annual revenue. It's a huge industry, and it's not very concentrated. The biggest players in the industry are a small percentage of the total volume, and there's lots of small players. What kinds of challenges and opportunities does that present?
But that is a center point of so many attempts to throw technology at an issue around this, extraordinary amount of carriers that are out there, how many need to be connected to. And I think that where you're seeing progress, where you're seeing folks like Emerge start to have some level of impact, is we're providing a capability that you can now get to through an app on your phone, you can get there through your computer, so that you as the 25 or 50 truck carrier can now see the same kinds of freight that the majors were the ones that we're seeing. So, if you think about it, Matt, in the terms of a procurement event, I'm running a procurement event. I'm typically going to think about how many asset providers I'm going to want, how many non-asset providers. And when you say non-asset, why would I use that? Well, that's the way that I've historically gone after the smaller carriers. It's certainly still a very reasonable way of doing so, but that doesn't encompass the totality that's out there. I, as the shipper running the event, I'm not inclined to try to integrate to hundreds or thousands of additional carriers. So I need to keep a reasonable limit on how many I'm going to be engaging with. With what you've seen in platforms like what Emerge is doing, you can bring that capacity from the 25, 50, 100 truck provider and have them be directly involved in that RFP, in that bid event, or in the spot market, providing the shipper then direct access to that capacity that they've never had before. And so I get the benefit as a shipper of being able to see so much more of the landscape of carriers out there. And I don't have to do it necessarily through an intermediary or a broker. And also from the carrier perspective, I'm now bringing so many more trucks, so much more capacity in the supply and demand equation that if I was a carrier, Matt, the thing that would get me is app fatigue. Where am I going? What load board am I looking to? Where am I going to try to get my freight? If I can come where I know the freight is going to be coming from the shippers that I want to work with, that I want them to know who I am, to know my identity, to know my locations, the capabilities that I have, that's really where I think this massive change over the last 4 or 5 years has occurred.
George, and you've been engaged in this for decades, but many listeners, when you talk about procurement, people may think, I know how to procure things. I've procured many things in my life. Procurement of truckload transportation, for example, has so many idiosyncrasies. Would you mind talking just a little bit about for example, the bid generation problem? Would you explain that in a little more detail?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so often, Matt, the tools that a shipper's been utilizing are what's available to them but also what allows them to actually have this bid occur in a relatively easy fashion. And what's occurred then is you're then seeing tools that are procurement tools, but may not be generating something that is applicable for transportation procurement as opposed to staplers or other material procurement. And so that the conundrum is that ease of use, the comfort factor. Everybody knows how to use Excel, but the limitations are significant. And so that bid generation challenge is twofold. One, the right tool, and then how and when do I run this? The cadence that I run it. And then as we talk about the writings of the brightest minds in the industry and in academia, the part that excites me now is, and has excited me for a long time, is continuing to evolve the best practices inside transportation procurement. When Chris wrote what he wrote back in 1997, and he and I worked together when OptiBid was the be all and end all around transportation procurement, you literally needed a PhD from MIT to run that product or run that code. You don't need that today, but the challenges that we're going after are so similar. And today, what you're able to do, because of the nimbleness and the ease of use, and we're talking about bid generation, how often do I run bids? What should my cadence be? When should I initiate the bid? How long should I leave the bid open? The cumbersome nature of the tools that aren't built for transportation or Excel, they don't help me with that. When you have tools that help you with that, it opens up a cornucopia, Matt, of my abilities to then decide, how do I run my bids? How often do I want to run them? And that's where the partnerships between the shippers and the carriers can start having an impact. And I apologize for being long-winded, but I got to tell one quick story. Someone that you know of. I worked at J.B. Hunt very early in my career, and I was lucky enough to have, and I'll actually go out of frame momentarily, I was actually lucky enough to have Mr. Hunt sign one of his hats. He signed this just a few months prior to his passing. And if I ever need any good luck, this is one of his. It's got his DNA in here. If I ever need any good luck, I rub my finger on the inside. But Mr. Hunt, reason I bring him up, Mr. Hunt, back when I worked there, when I was a child, Matt, in the 80s and 90s, Mr. Hunt used to talk about how shippers wouldn't live to their commitments. Shippers think that carriers don't live to their commitments. What's happening today with the opportunities for the bidding platforms to be able to better have the correct carrier on the correct load, that's when commitments will be maintained and kept to. And so that's where Mr. Hunt was complaining about it 35 plus years ago, but that is now being answered in a way that has not been answered before because of how the technology and how the platform of scale is able to answer the question.
So George, you've got the bid generation problem.
Yep.
And then you've got to pick winners of the auction, if you will.
Yep.
And you're talking about this issue associated with the non-binding nature of truckload contracts.
True.
I'd like to, how are the winners of the auction determined? What are the factors in that?
That there's never been an auction, a procurement event, Matt, that's been run where someone doesn't push the low-cost solve button. That low-cost solve button is catnip. It's something that you just are drawn to. Most of the time, a great overwhelming preponderance of the time, the low-cost solve isn't the only parameter that's going to be considered. If that's the only parameter that you're going to consider and you're going to publish a routing guide based solely on a low-cost solve, that routing guide will probably be obsolete the moment that it's published, because something will have changed. There will be an impact in the low-cost solves carriers network. It might not break down, for a little bit of time. The market might be loose enough, but the low-cost solve is, though, a critical component. We clearly have to think about cost, but then you have to consider service levels. How are service levels considered? How do I grade a carrier like J.B. Hunt versus a carrier like Werner versus a carrier like Schneider and Knight Swift? But then how do I grade when I'm looking at the 50, 100, 200 truck fleets? And that's where those fleets becoming involved and being able to show their service levels provides them the opportunity to act like the bigger ones do. And really, when you think about these factors of how is the awarding done within the auction or within the event, that's where you've got to have transportation specific software capabilities to be able to scenario plan that. And I described earlier, I'm going to run a bid, and when I was, at Transplace, helping to run billions of dollars worth of freight for hundreds of shippers, we would have, when we would be, going to them with a procurement event, we would have here's the best practices list. Those best practices were somewhat cornered by what we were able to do from a technology perspective, but it was the beginning of being able to look at alternatives to the annual bid is the best way to do it, and giving 90% to assets and 10% to non-asset providers. That was the center lane that everybody was driving in, but boy, there were opportunities to make better decisions, to make J.B. Hunt the man happy, to get better commitments and commitments being lived up to on both sides. And so that's where my excitement is now, is that there's so much opportunity for each individual shipper to think about, why do they want to award their freight to this set of carriers differently than others do? And carriers, why do I want to work with these shippers versus other shippers? We now have the opportunity to define all of those things. And when you're building the solve, be able to put that solve together, which means you're going to have a routing guide that stays more in place and doesn't fall apart the way that so many have done in the past.
So, because again, there's a lot of people listening that are not familiar with truckload procurement, I want to ask you to go into a little more detail on two issues you brought up.
Yep.
One issue you brought up, people would think, wait a minute, if a carrier has agreed to do something and the shipper said, okay, we'll take your bid, well, what's the deal? Why aren't they executing? Okay. So if you could speak a little bit to the non-binding nature of the truckload contracts, because this is something people may not be familiar with. And the second thing, you mentioned a routing guide.
Yeah.
Again, for those of us that are involved in transportation, we know what that is. But if you could talk about those two things a little bit, I think it might be helpful.
Yeah, I'll start with the poorly named contract rates. There's typically been, Matt, the thought that there are two types of rates, contract and spot. And I think I'd like to nuance that a little bit as we talk a little bit more. But staying on contract, there is nothing contractually liable with regards to those rates. I'm awarding Waller Trucking 100 loads this week for every week of the next 52 weeks. and they are the contract loads that you're going to be accepting when they are awarded to you. But by week 2, if you only decide that you have capacity to handle 75 of them, or I, as the shipper, only have the production to give you 75 of them, there's nothing contractual that is obligating either of us to that. There are certainly separate individual contracts that some shippers, high value products, high sensitive service requirements. You'll see in the automotive industry where you'll see those kinds of things become where a genuine contract exists. But by and large, when we say contract rates, there is no legal binding nature to it. As a matter of fact, my friend and the Freightways founder, Craig Fuller, he was asked, and I'm going to butcher this a little bit, but there was a Twitter poll that said, if you were being held captive, what would you say in the video to convince people that you were not speaking with free will? And Craig said something like, contract rates are legally binding. Craig Fuller says contract rates are legally binding. You know that he is saying that under duress. He is not saying that. So that element is critical to the routing guide, which is when I run my event, I run my scenarios that are taking into account incumbency, any number of factors, incumbency or minority-based carriers, sustainability, certain capacity, certain carriers have greater levels of sustainability than others, women-owned carriers. There's any number of ways that I can weight, WEIGHC, that I can weight the scenarios. And when I build those scenarios, including cost, of course, I then will have an output that I need to deliver to all of these providers that are going to be contracted with me for whatever the time frame is that I've defined the duration of this bid to be. And when I award that, I've then constructed in its totality a routing guide. And that routing guide, depending on how you want to strategically implement it, is something through the transportation management system that's being utilized will be implemented. The most typical is described, Matt, as a waterfall. So that I've got 20 loads a day on a particular lane. I'm awarding all of that to Carrier A as a primary. Carrier A has committed to taking those 20, but on Tuesday, they can't take all 20. They only take 17. What happens to those 3? Any number of things can happen, and that's where my routing guide takes place. I may waterfall down to whom I've determined should get it in the second position. I may go multiple positions, and depending on the tool, you may do that. You may go immediately to the spot market, depending on your needs, the rapidness of response. So the routing guide and how well the needs of the shipper and the needs of the carrier or the provider are put together. And Matt, that is sort of where I'm most excited right now, is what historically was the best practice. There was a bid season. Bid season typically is about right now up until the holidays. It was typically when and going to be awarded sometime in the first part of the year, when carriers would have less freight to haul, so that they would probably be a little more aggressive during bid season. But this is what was called bid season. That still exists today. There's still a majority of freight that is contracted for the next calendar year that is bid during this end of Q3 all the way into Q4. That still very much exists, but the length of that contract, the duration as we described, and the mechanisms by which I can award to can split those 20 loads I was talking about into 2 people taking 10. That flexibility is evolving best practices so that routing guides won't fail as quickly, either if the market is moving tighter, which may incent a carrier to try to go find freight that's paying them more, or if the market is loosening, where that might entice a shipper to try to find capacity that's paying a little that is going to require them to pay a little bit less. So my excitement is I may run a 90-day contract bid, and my carriers love that because they know I am considering incumbency. I'm considering their service levels way more than this typical, well, a year is the right length of time. It's a massively changing industry. There's still a lot of great shippers that are appropriately determining that a year and the way that they run their bids and the timing on their bids makes sense to be an annual bid. But there's a lot of freight now, Matt, that has moved. And some of the volatility over the last 3 or 4 years has certainly enhanced this, but that people have moved to the 90-day bid, the 6-month bid. And you might think that may or may not be the most pleasant thing that a carrier is going to want. Sometimes it might not be, but we have a particular customer at Emerge who has said they run their entire network every 90 days. You would think that carriers would not like that. You would think that would just be, how can I plan? How can I set up to have my network being appropriately planned out for a length of time? But that shipper values incumbency significantly in the way that they are awarding each of these 90 days. And they say that they're using an Emerge platform to be able to do short-term execution of a long-term strategy. That was mind-blowing for me because we had long-term strategies in the past, but we had to have long-term bid durations. That's not the case anymore.
Right. And, the more volatility there is in the economy, the more you would expect more frequent bidding to occur.
Yep.
And when George was talking about incumbency, it means the carriers that are already handling that lane. But the waterfall nature of the routing guides really illustrates the non-binding nature of the truckload contracts. And, for those of you that are new to this, if you think about it, there's no way a carrier can absolutely guarantee they're going to have certain equipment at a certain place in a certain period of time. If they did, it would be quite expensive. So it's really in nobody's interest to actually do that unless you're willing to pay a lot for it. But similarly, for shippers, for those of you that are new to this, it's hard for them to know exactly when they're going to need to ship products over certain lanes and how much. They're estimating. It's a forecast. And that's why I believe there was a law actually passed or some kind of a regulation that said carriers, these are non-binding agreements at some point.
Yep.
And it makes a lot of sense. And so one of the things you mentioned as you were describing this waterfall nature of the routing guide, and by the way, the reason I'm getting into some of this is because so many times when I listen to, again, as a professor, when I'm using content from outside for students, I'm very cognizant of the fact that many times people don't know what these things mean, and it can be very confusing. But one thing you said that is really interesting that I think would be good to highlight is if you go down the waterfall and you've exhausted all of your alternatives, then you go into the spot market. Could you describe what that is?
Sure. And as we talked about, there's been historically 2 types of truckload freight, contract and spot. And when we talk truckload, we're primarily talking about over the road, the the interesting elements where procurement capabilities or platforms can now move into other modes, consider an intermodal versus truckload, all of the sustainability benefits. But as you think about contract and spot, Matt, for spot, and again, those being the two, the spot is those loads that are now free agents. They're up for grabs, and the shipper needs to determine what method am I going to use to get that load covered, get some carrier to commit to haul it for them, and actually then get that carrier to follow through. There's now a number of load boards that are out there where what will oftentimes occur is those spot loads very often get picked up or get accepted by the larger brokers or brokers, and those brokers, having access to many carriers, will find a carrier to cover that spot load. But now you're starting to eat away at whatever profits were inside of that load. And what if it goes directly from shipper to carrier, there's, hopefully going to be some positive spread there that the carrier will be able to make some money. If you need an intermediary, by definition, someone in the middle to find that capacity, that intermediary is going to be taking some of that margin. So those spot loads, those free agents, they're out there trying to find a home. I think, Matt, and we've been talking a lot about this as we've done $16 billion worth of freight over the last year and a half or so running through our platform. It's not as simple as just those two terms. There's a middle ground. And so often what Andrew Leto, our founder, has coined is low volume contract lanes, LVCL as we call it. And what those are, Matt, those end up oftentimes being spot loads because they're called low volume contract lanes because they're put in a contract bid, and they're not my high volume lanes. They're not my Pareto 80-20. I'm 80% of my freight is moving on 20% of my lanes. 20% of my freight is moving on 80% of my lanes. So those low volume lanes, they still go in the bid, but they're the first ones to have challenges in the commitments being met. Because to your point about a carrier not being able to know where their capacity is going to be, well, if it's a low volume lane, I can't be sure that I'm going to have a truck in that area. But it's put in the bid, it's leveraged to some degree, but it ends up being the first thing that falls apart. Those are really spot loads, but they're just not called them because they fail on the routing guide relatively quickly and they end up in the spot market. And those need to go into a spot capability that has consistent carriers in there. No, there's some element in the industry, Matt, in some of these load boards where people will put faux loads or fake loads because they're just trying to find what the rates are. I might put, a suburb of Seattle going to Fort Worth when I really just want to know what the rates are from Seattle to Dallas. And those, if you have a provider that has the ability for their spot entity to give you real loads, then that takes away so much of the bid fatigue and the app fatigue that those carriers have that are trying to make money in the spot market. And as you talk about volatility, one only needs to look at the spot market from a price standpoint. The spot market, my friends at FreightWaves are showing that the spot market rate at the end of 21 into 22 was $4-ish a mile. There was a massive influx of new carriers because, Matt, I'm no trucker, love truckers. I'm no trucker. I could make money as a trucker at $4 a mile. But you look at what happened over the next 7 or 8 months, and it moved south of $2 a mile. I care who you are, you're gonna have trouble making money at those kind of low rates. So anyway, the spot market is that capacity need. The capacity needs there are very different from the contract side, and you've got to get away from those load boards where there's not going to be as much integrity as you would hope.
And carriers, naturally, if demand for transportation is increasing, they're more likely to reject loads tendered. And by the way, if a shipper tenders a load, it just means they're saying to a carrier, I'd like you to take this load from here to here. Right. That's what tendering means, for those listening. But as sometimes carriers will reject them because they realize I could get a better deal, right?
Yep. Exactly.
And but there's so many things that factor into it, like the cost of diesel fuel and even the uncertainty of diesel fuel. So how is diesel price uncertainty and the use of fuel surcharges factored into the carrier assignment decision? And when we say fuel surcharges, for those listening, it's an extra fee that's charged by the carrier.
Well, so much of that, Matt, is advantageous to the larger carriers that have their ability to either buy at a greater level of discount than I may as an individual owner operator, or they'll have the ability to pump on their own at their own terminals. So what you'll tend to see now, and platforms that are doing this in the right way are trying to eliminate any tomfoolery around how much is being in the surcharge versus my rate. People are looking at it now, Matt, as an all-in rate, because it's to some degree, the analogy that I like to think about is when you're trading your car in and you're being offered X amount for it, but then they're charging you Y amount for the car that you're wanting to buy. There's an amount that the dealership wants to have as their net. Well, they may give you $1 for your car and charge you dramatically less for what you're buying. They just want to find that ground. That's what's attempting to happen with the fuel and the line haul. Line haul being the actual carrying of the load from point A to point B. So all the costs in my line haul, my truck, my driver, all that, there's in my line haul, and that's what I'm charging the shipper, and hopefully profit for the carrier. And then I'm adding fuel into that. Trying to make that an all-in rate takes away or levels the playing field a lot, but there's still always going to be an inherent advantage for those larger carriers that are able to buy in bulk or pump at their own terminals compared to you or I, pulling into the Flying J or the Pilot and fueling there at what is today's price and tomorrow's price, might actually be a lot lower, but we've already fueled up our truck.
Such a good point. No matter what kind of business decision someone's making, it's always better to look at the total cost and not be fooled by all these variables.
Exactly.
I always tell people it's good to use common sense as much as possible. If something seems too confusing, there's probably a reason it's confusing.
That's it, and that it really goes to where transportation procurement has gone to over the time. That there was this confusion, and I want to as a carrier place myself on a routing guide at a certain spot because I'm hoping that there's going to be rejections and it will get to me. Let's take out a lot of that confusion. Let's make sure that the carriers have visibility to the freight that's good for them and good for their networks, which will lead to better service, happier drivers, lower driver turnover, all of those kind of things. And Matt, something that I need to point out, you talk about the expensive nature of if I was going to have a truck there every day, that's when you get into the dedicated or private fleets.
Yes.
Those, a dedicated or private fleet tends to and works for one particular shipper. One of the largest fleets in the country is Amazon. Another of the largest ones is Walmart. They are servicing their facilities, but then there's capacity trying to get them back to wherever they need that driver to then make his load and pick up for the next day. And there's still so much available space moving around empty that when you look at platforms like ours, like Emerge, you see an opportunity for those kinds of providers to come in at a very reasonable rate for the shipper and have them be able to capture some of that capacity. The challenge has always been there, and it is always going to be there. That dedicated or private truck has to be somewhere the next day. It may have left the Bentonville distribution center for Walmart and gone somewhere, and now it needs to get back. It'll give you great service at a very good rate getting back, but it has to go back. It can't be left wanting. It will and needs to be back to pick up its next load the next day.
George, this has been great. Very educational, very informative. Thank you so much for taking time to visit with us today.
Thanks for having me. You know how highly I respect you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to chat about something that I think the passion came through. So if anybody has any interest in talking about transportation procurement, I'm connected in all the normal ways, so I would love to do so.
George, thank you so much. I do appreciate it. If you're finding value in this podcast, we greatly appreciate your support by subscribing to our YouTube channel. Additionally, following us on Apple and Spotify and leaving up to a 5-star review would be immensely helpful. We welcome any feedback or questions related to the podcast, as well as suggestions for further topics and guests. You can leave your comments on our YouTube channel, and rest assured that I will read each and every one of them. Please also take a moment to check out our podcast sponsors, as they play a critical role in keeping this podcast running. For more information on specific topics, timestamps, or links to articles mentioned during the podcast, head over to mattwallerpodcast.com.